Okay, hello class. And just to make sure that everything, because as you can see, I'm doing this from home. So if there's any problems with the Zoom, let me know, and I'll try to address it. I think we have a fewer number of students on today, but that's all right. And I wanted to begin by saying a bit about the group presentation. Some of it I have said previously, and so it's just by way of reminder. But some issues like schedule and so forth, that will be new information, but I have also just put it onto Canvas. So what I'll be saying here will also be on Canvas as well. Well, you know by now for the group presentation that you are analyzing the abstract that your group has been assigned, and you're going through the various steps, analyzing it into clauses, transitivity, logical structure, rhetorical structure, mood, modality, and theme. And as a group, as part of your group presentation, discussing how your analysis, uh, the results that you get, the patterns that you observe, how that contributes to the texture. When I talk about texture, I'm talking about the cohesiveness of the text. Contributes to the texture and the architecture. And by architecture, again, I'm using the sort of the metaphor of architecture to describe the coherence of the text, how the parts fit together. Now that's what I'm expecting your group to be talking about. In other words, you'll be talking about the analysis. You'll be giving us some observations, some statistics, showing us some tables, identifying the patterns. But then I want you to go back to take a look at it and see how that has contributed to making a more cohesive and more coherent text. That's what your group will be discussing, okay? The individual commentary is a bit different than that, and that is that you're there evaluating the text, evaluating it in terms of how well it sort of uh, fits the expectations of what is good abstract writing. So how do you evaluate it based on your analysis? So I want you to sort of apply what you've identified through your analysis, through your discussion. I want you to take it a step further, and I want you to evaluate it. I want you to consider whether it was good or not good, or what made it good. Okay, so that sort of roughly summarizes what you were doing. And the abstracts, you definitely should have seen them already on Canvas and should be analyzing. And I've gotten some emails from you, your class, asking about the analysis and so forth. And to my understanding, I have replied to everyone who has emailed me. If I somehow missed something, do repeat it, do send it back, okay? Do resend it, and so I'll take notice of it. That, by the way, should be sort of what you do when you're emailing me. If for some reason you didn't seem to get a reply, you emailed me, definitely follow it up, okay? Because sometimes it's easy to miss the emails amongst all those that come into the inbox, okay? And I've given you some sort of sites to go and look at, and I'll be paying attention. I mean, did you go and really look it up in terms of what, for example, the Linguistic Society of America was saying about model abstracts? In other words, did you go beyond just analyzing your text to actually, and this will be really important for the individual commentary. This was another page, also with some examples, and then finally this a rather long. I'll take it. I'll give you that. It's a rather long webinar, and he has a question and answer session. I here am giving you also the YouTube link in case that might be more helpful to you in being able to connect up and look at that. But here again, strongly urge you to take a look at this and use it as a helpful resource, especially when it comes to your individual commentary. So these are the steps again that we'll expect to see in your presentation, that you cover these various steps in terms of your analysis, and none of this should become as a surprise. This I'm sure that you've already been engaged with and doing. And I did provide with you, it was under week 6, grammatical analysis template. Please use that, all right? And in fact, I'll be telling you in a moment that I would like you to not only submit your PowerPoint, but also submit your Excel file. This Excel file should follow this template and provide your analysis in the various the worksheets in the Excel file. All right, so now here's the schedule. Now remember, as I've told you before, the due date is all of you. I mean, all of the groups, all right, are required to submit by noon next Monday. Some of you will be presenting next Monday. Some of you will be presenting the following week. So this is this schedule, and it's important because all of your group members must be attending, must be there, must be taking part, all right? I expect that in your group, everyone will be presenting some aspect of that presentation. Now, you'll be doing it, this PowerPoint, inserting the audio and so forth. So this should be something that you've already been done before. You've done your analysis, you've designated who's doing it, and that person should be presenting that part of the presentation. Now, what am I asking, though, for next Monday? What I'm asking is, on the day that you give your presentation, the first 20 minutes is your presentation. You will send me the files, the PowerPoint files and the Excel files, and I will upload those to Canvas. And the rest of the class will download that PowerPoint, take a look at it, go through it, and at the end of that 20 minutes, have a question and answer session. Now, I hope others will also ask questions and take part, but I will also be asking questions, and I'll be wanting to direct questions to the various members of your team. So please all be online, especially on that day that your group is going to be presenting. That's very important. No one should be absent on that day that your group is presenting in that time, okay? So please do take note of that. I tried to allow a little leeway, all right? So that we begin at 5 past the noon. That's so because I'll be uploading the files to Canvas, and you'll be getting the files and downloading them and so forth. Beginning about 5 past, I would appreciate very much if you, while the deadline is noon, I would appreciate if you did submit it earlier. That would certainly be helpful to me so that I can upload it to Canvas, and not on next Monday at noon, suddenly needing to upload it to Canvas and people download it. So I would appreciate it if you would be submitting your PowerPoint presentation, making your submission before noon, not just right sharp at noon. All right, that would be helpful. So what do you need to submit? What you need to submit are the following: an Excel file following the grammatical analysis template. Your data should be entered into that Excel file. I should be able to see the analysis that you've done. All right, so for the various aspects. Now, you might say to me, okay, well, what about mood? Well, in that case, you don't have to. It's not part of the. I follow the the template that I provided. The template means that in your Excel file, all that you need to submit is your transitivity, logical, and theme with the Excel file. Now, I assume that there will be other aspects of the rhetorical structure, discussion about the modality, that will be in your PowerPoint. All right. Now, the PowerPoint file will have audio inserted into each slide. And if you have any questions about how to do that, please do ask me. All right, how you insert the audio. I assume that for most of you, you should be able to do that. Record what you want to say for each slide, insert that into the slide, and then everyone can be able to hear the presentation. One more thing. The title slide for the PowerPoint should list all the team members. Okay? On your title slide, list the team members and what each team member did. All right? In other words, who did transitivity, who did theme, and so forth. Identify the roles with respect to each of the members. So you got it, what you need to submit. An Excel file following the grammatical analysis template, and that will cover theme and logical and transitivity. A PowerPoint file with the audio inserted into each slide with a title slide listing the team members and for each giving their respective responsibilities. Now, how to submit? Submit it by email to me with the attachments. Send to ctjjw@cityu.edu.hk, my email address. Be sure to give the subject line, as you see here, indicating your group number, indicating that is for this course, LT3213, and it's the presentation. And with your email, I will expect to find attachments, including an Excel file and a PowerPoint file. All right, so that's what you need to submit and how to submit it. There's a question, can we make a workload table at the end of slide, or must we make it the title slide? You can have a workload table. I'd appreciate it at the beginning. All right. You mean at the end of slide? You mean at the end of the slides, I assume. All right. Can you put it at the end instead of at the beginning? I suppose so. I want to be able to find it easily. All right. So that's why I asked it to be at the beginning, so that right away I see it there. And I want it to be prominent, that we see who was responsible. So that it'll be sort of the first thing I'll be wanting to look at, and that will be who's doing what in the PowerPoint presentation that follows. I would appreciate it at the beginning, okay? It would be helpful to me. Does the audio insertion mean we don't need to present orally in real time? Yes, exactly. You won't be presenting it in real time. It will be something whereby we download that PowerPoint file with the audio, and we'll be listening to that. That's your PowerPoint presentation. Now, yes, there is a real-time aspect to this. The real-time aspect is that last 10 minutes. In that last 10 minutes, that's the question and answer time. That's the time I and hopefully your classmates will engage with you on what you've been presenting. All right, so, but I wanted sort of there, we have the PowerPoint, we have the audio inserted, we follow through it on our own for 20 minutes and go through it. everybody, and then at the end of that period, that's when there will be real time. Okay. All right. So yes, and it seems that I've answered those two questions. Good questions. Thank you for asking them, and hope that gives clarification. There aren't many of your classmates here today, so and I don't know how representative those of you who are here are of the various groups. So I do hope I do hope that your classmates will pay attention to the announcement on Canvas and everyone will follow through with this, okay? All right, so I wanted to talk about the midterm test. I haven't finished marking yet, and I'm working on that, and hopefully we'll be able to give it to you soon. The midterm test, I did want to just sort of talk about it a bit in terms of what my expectations were. Okay. So, for example, Section A. Now, remember, Section A has said that see the attached data tables for transitivity, logical, and theme analyses from the systemic functional analysis of the closing statement of Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney in the third debate with U.S. President Obama. All right, so that's gave the setting to you. It was that third debate, something that I already mentioned to you and had talked about with you with respect to Obama's performance. But here I was giving you the data and the text from Mitt Romney's performance. I'm asking you then, what patterns do you observe in the text? This is a sort of, again, it's the same kind of question that I'm expecting you to be following, not just here, but also in your presentations. On the final exam. The final exam will be somewhat similar, all right? We will have another text and similar. So in a way, the midterm was a good practice for what will be on the final, and will count considerably more than the midterm. How has fit to context likely influenced the patterning you observe here in this text? And here you're being asked to sort of identify how the nature of the text, the context, what's going on, how that sort of, in a way, determined, affected the text that you end up observing. With reference to the discussion in class about Obama's performance in the same debate, as we talked about, in fact, it was lecture 1, it was the first lecture, compare Romney's performance with Obama's. So here I'm asking you to actually compare it because I knew you had the data for it, and discuss how the use of language may have contributed to the response of those watching the debate. You also know the polling, right? And so the patterns and how they fit to context, that's what I'm asking you. But we had discussed this in class, and I had already, as I said, mainly with respect to Obama's performance. But I had mentioned to you that there were 3 debates, and this was the third debate. And I had also mentioned to you about the polling. So we knew somewhat how people responded to, here was the first debate. And remember, the point that I was making in lecture was mainly that in that first debate, Obama did what was considered poorly, described as an inept performance. And the polling showed that people responded much more favorably to Romney than to Obama. We were asking ourselves, why was that the case? And we tried to identify reasons for why that was the case. And this was the third debate. Now, this was what would be relevant to you here with respect to the text that you're looking at. And we noticed that Obama did considerably better, especially in the CBS poll. In the CNN poll, it was more closer, all right? But still, Obama came out ahead, of Romney in the polling.
Thank you, Bob, Mr. President, folks at Lynn University. Good to be with you. I'm optimistic about the future. I'm excited about our prospects as a nation. I want to see peace. I want to see growing peace in this country. It's our objective. We have an opportunity to have real leadership. America is going to have that kind of leadership and continue to promote principles of peace that will make a world a safer place and make people in this country more confident that their future is secure. I also want to make sure that we get this economy going. And there are two very different paths the country can take. One is a path represented by the president, which at the end of 4 years would mean we'd have $20 trillion in debt heading towards Greece. I'll get us on track to a balanced budget. The president's path will mean continuing declining in take-home pay. I want to make sure our take-home pay turns around and starts to grow. The president's path means 20 million people out of work, struggling for a good job. I'll get people back to work with 12 million new jobs. I'm going to make sure that we get people off of food stamps, not by cutting the program, but by getting them good jobs. America is going to come back, and for that to happen, we're going to have a president who can work across the aisle. I was in a state where my legislature was 87% Democrat. I learned how to get along on the other side of the aisle. We've got to do that in Washington. Washington is broken. I know what it takes to get this country back, and we'll work with good Democrats and good Republicans to do that. This nation is the hope of the earth. We've been blessed by having a nation that's free and prosperous thanks to the contributions of the greatest generation. They've held a torch for the world to see, a torch of freedom and hope and opportunity. Now it's our turn to take that torch. I'm convinced we'll do it. We need strong leadership. I'd like to be that leader with your support. I'll work with you. I'll lead you in an open and honest way. And I ask for your vote. I'd like to be the next president of the United States to support and help this great nation and to make sure that we all together maintain America as the hope of the earth. Thank you so much.
Okay, so now, of course, you didn't listen to him speak it, but you did read it. And when you got that text, I assume the first thing you did was read through it. I mean, that's important because it will give you sort of an idea of sort of what's happening with that text. There should be some things that will just, even before you look at the analysis, sort of pop out at you. And in this case, it was the first thing I wanted you to do, and this is, I do think, important, no matter what text you're looking at, frame it within the context of situation and ask yourself, what are your expectations given the typical features of text occurring in that context of situation? Well, what's the context of situation here? There's a debate. Even more precise, it was the closing statement. Well, the closing statement, what might you, it's not now sort of a back and forth between the two candidates or even the moderator. Here it is something which they most likely prepared for. It's most likely something they perhaps memorized. It's not spontaneous, okay? It isn't spontaneous like it might be during the actual debate itself. This is the closing statement, most likely prepared beforehand, written beforehand, probably to some degree memorized beforehand. Now that will make a difference. And think about the debate then interpersonally. What is it? What is happening? You're trying to persuade your audience that you are the better candidate. So it's an attempt to be persuasive as well. You're trying to persuade. You're not just informing your audience. You're trying to persuade with. You're trying to engage with them. So there is an interaction that is involved here. So mode. Yes, it is spoken, but most likely it was written, not spontaneous. Interpersonally, tenor, you're relating to your audience, you're trying to persuade them that this is, you are the best candidate. Field, what are you talking about? What you're talking about is, well, in his case, what he expected to do as president. Expected to do. Now, it's something that's why I say you read the text beforehand, and something should have sort of shouted out at you in terms of what he was saying. Now, the first thing, though, we'll take a look is transitivity and process. What process types are there? Who is in the ER role? Who is doing what? Now, in this case, as I look at the sort of the table that's in front of me, I go down to look at I see want mentioned several times, all right? And so that would be sort of a mental process, what he wants, all right? And at the end, what he likes, all right? So that's one thing about, when I looked at this, though, what I thought was most interesting about the transitivity, and then I go back to take a look at the text itself, was its future orientation. You see, he's not the president now. He's not defending his past. He's not defending anything. He's putting it out there, projecting what he would do in the future. And so it becomes very much, and that's why I've highlighted here in red. I've gone through and I want to see America's going to continue to promote, that will make. I also want to make sure that we get this economy going. So when he says, I want to, what's he saying? It's something that he's not yet doing. Well, he's not president. So it's something that he can only sort of promise to do. And so it is very future oriented, is very much promising what he will do in the future. But that is what you would expect probably. But he cannot be talking about, I will do this, I have done this, or this has been my policy, or these have been my successes. It's all sort of the potential. It's all sort of the promise of what he hopes to do. Effectively, I think to say, I want to do this, I want to do this, it made it sound so, to me, it came across as so individual. I want. But I'll get us. So I'm going to make sure. I also want. Okay, you see, it's repeating, I want this. I'm going to do this. But how effective is that? How effective was that? In the sense that what he's talking about is his desire. I want. Future oriented. That to me probably would not have been as effective. Instead, if he had said more indefinitely what will be done, not just what he wants to do, but what will be done. That I thought was a weakness within which comes through in terms of the transitivity. It's a repetitive pattern. It's very future oriented. It's dealing with promise, potential, and very first person. I. Continues through the rest of the text as well. So what I would have probably been identifying when I looked at the transitivity would be what was I doing? And I in the sense of not only the want to, but also in the sense of the future. I'll do this, I'll do that. All right, so transitivity. Now, you might notice I didn't sort of list out, okay, how many processes are material, how many processes are mental. In a way, I think that probably wouldn't have been that helpful to observe something which was a pattern, but the pattern really went beyond what was in the table. And this I would encourage you to also realize that, yes, you can do that. For example, transitivity structure. You can see the process, participant, circumstance. And sometimes you've got your data, but your data doesn't really show you what's going on there. It had to do with, in many ways, an aspect of tense, what he will do. It had to do with the idea of, also a sense of I want to. The idea of very first person, very much in the sense of promise, potential, but not yet realized. Logical. Again, I go back to look at my table, and here I would be doing some counting. And when I go through and do the counting, I would be making reference to what I've observed in class, in the discussions. You remember when we talked about Trump, I compared, because there was a lot of talk about Trump not being hypotactic, like he doesn't know how to be hypotactic. You remember that discussion? We looked at, in fact, Trump's. We looked at his speech to Congress. We looked at his speech to the CIA, and noticed the difference between them. And also compared with Nixon's, some of Nixon's speeches, and some of Obama's other speeches. So the data was there. The data was there in your past lectures. All right. So it's something I expected you would be referring to. Okay, if I take a look at the data that I see here, what do I observe? First of all, in Romney's talk, I just look at the sentences. I just went down the list here and counted basically, and observed that there were 18 simple, no expansion, either parataxis or hypotaxis. And there were 17 that involved either parataxis or hypotaxis complex. So in fact, it was quite half-half, simple versus complex, which was interesting, because that meant there was quite a lot of simple sentences, and I suppose that probably would have been deliberate. But where I observe something that I can sort of make reference to other speeches that I've also analyzed, paratactic versus hypotactic. And there you just count the relations that are there. There were 6 examples of parataxis, 28 examples of hypotaxis, 17% paratactic, 82% hypotactic. Now, that was similar to what I would have observed, for example, Nixon's second inaugural. In fact, that sort of imbalance where there was way more hypotaxis than parataxis. And we see it repeatedly throughout these speeches, Nixon's, Obama's, and even in Trump's speech to Congress. What can we say about these speeches? These speeches are all spoken, yes, but obviously scripted. Obviously scripted. Well, that corresponded to our expectation, right? We start off by saying, well, this is the closing statement in the debate. This is the part that is prepared for. This is the one that is sort of written to be, or scripted to be spoken. It fits. The patterning corresponds to that sort of mode, written like, which is more hypotactic. Why? Because hypotaxis is something that needs to sort of be thought through. You sort of need to see the connections. It's not just sequencing, adding this to that. It is seeing this one is related to this one, and this is more important, and this is more crucial than this, and this is sort of supporting that. Well, hypotaxis takes some thought. And that kind of thinking is something that we can do when we can sort of write it out beforehand, script it out. And then we can think about it. Well, that is reflected here. And that would have been fit. That would have fit my expectation. Again, you should be making reference to what we've looked at in class and taking that information. This is what I'm testing you on, is the way you can apply what you have heard and to a new text. Theme. Well, when looked at theme, you probably would have noticed a lot of ands here, but remember, where it was paratactic, it was largely and, right? But then here, I did give you this data before. I did mention to you about the use of I and we, these pronouns as theme, when I was talking about Obama's speech. And the third debate, Romney debate, we noticed that there was already, we had I 38%, we 23%. In fact, it was something we've noticed before about these speeches, which tend to be very first person, because yes, it is the person sort of explaining why they want to be president. But then there is also the mention of we. There was no you. That's interesting to me, that there is just absolutely, there's no you. There's no, I guess because it's supposed to be about them, the candidates. But it strikes me that there's no sort of attempt to involve you in terms of what this candidate will do as president. So I really had given you the data in this case, and you could have compared it with Obama's performance, which was what I was asking you to do. That was section A. So yes, I did choose this text precisely because I had sort of given you the other side, Obama's performance, and was expecting you to be able to take note of that, compare that, apply what we learned from looking at Obama's and apply it now to looking at Romney's. So that's the idea. That you see, what I'm wanting you to be able to do is I want you to be able to take a look at what we've done before, and all of that should be sort of building up as far as your expertise for what you are looking for ahead, what other new texts you come across. It's not just sort of like starting from scratch, all right? It's taking what you've learned before and applying it. All right, section B. Let's talk about section B. M.A.K. Halliday argues that the lexicogrammar enables the meaning-making potential in language. So thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically, writes Halliday. This was, I remember this quote very well because this is the journal of which I'm the founding editor, Linguistics and the Human Sciences. And this was the launch issue. This was the first issue of the journal. And Halliday had agreed to write this paper for this first issue of the journal, Linguistics and the Human Sciences. So I remember this quote very well, and it's always struck me. Thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. Based on what you know about Halliday's approach to the study of language, namely systemic functional linguistics, what is meant by thinking grammatically? And I ask you, as I will always ask you with a question like this, illustrate your discussion with examples. Okay, so how would you have approached this? And what did we say about this? We had already mentioned this in the lecture. Halliday describes a language as being more, we said, than a semiotic system. It is a system that makes meanings. It is a semogenic system. It is a system of meaning based on choice. You choose. You can do this or you can do that. And by the choices that you make meaning. And the choices are significant. Now, what kind of choices, though, are you making? What enables this meaning-making potential in language is the lexicogrammar, the grammar. Or, as Halliday says, thinking about meaning means thinking grammatically. So what are the choices? In other words, what I was not wanting you to do is just talk about the meta-functions, all right? Now, the meta-functions are important, yes. And some of you talked about ideational, interpersonal, and textual. But the real focus was on the other side of the table. wording. When we talk about meaning, meaning is invisible. It's neither here nor there, so to speak. Where it is in the wording. And what is the wording? The wording is the grammar. And from Halliday's point of view, what is thinking grammatically involved? It involves the ways in which you realize kinds of meaning. It is the choices that you make about the kind of process you choose, who initiates that process, what are the circumstances. The kinds of choices that you just finished looking at in Romney's text. How you identify the role of the speaker here, mood structure. How you identify the attitude, modality. How you identify how the message is organized. What you put first, theme, the focus. This is where I wanted you to pick up on the idea that thinking about meaning means, yes, thinking grammatically. It means thinking about the wording. And by the wording, what it means is specifically those kinds of choices through which the meaning is realized. Systems of transitivity, system of theme, information structure. So when you talk about transitivity, you're talking about the participant roles, the process types. And when you talk about the process types and distinguish those process types, how did you do so? Thinking about meaning, thinking about how these are different means thinking grammatically, how they behave grammatically. Can a process, must a process take a human participant? One of the questions. A mental process, yes, it must. Material process, no. What kind of processes can project, expand through projecting that clause? Mental processes, verbal processes, even to some extent relational processes, but not material. You see, the whole point was that this is what I was wanting you to focus on. Not just the meta functions by themselves, which some of you did, but instead looking at how that meaning is realized in the grammar. And by the grammar, it means not just subject-verb agreement. It doesn't mean just the ways in which you use, which tense you are able to use and how you express tense and those kinds of things. Yeah, it's part of grammar, but it's not the whole aspect of it. We illustrated this through the choices that were made in terms of Donald Jung versus Susan Rice. And this I mentioned in the review as well. How those choices that in terms of who is doing what, who is the initiator in terms of the actual process, reflected the ideology of these two speakers. All right, so that's what I was expecting. It didn't have to be transitivity. There are other aspects of thinking grammatically, choice of theme and so forth like that. Mood choice. These are aspects of what it means to, when we're thinking about meaning, not just sort of escaping into the invisible, some reality that we cannot sort of pin down, but instead really looking at how meaning is made, and it's made through the choices in terms of wording, grammar. All right, so the second question was this: the history of scientific discourses reveals new ways of making meaning in language for new ways of thinking. Professor David Butt, in an article entitled Disciplinary English, The Knight's Move in Halliday's Theories of Verbal Science and Verbal Art. Professor David Butt describes this new way of making meaning in scientific discourse as a grammatical drift that creates a novel intensity in the way writers in English can construe experience. What is the nature of this grammatical drift to which but refers? And again, illustrate your discussion with examples. I think that we might just, it's about 1:15, and I think we'll take a break here because otherwise this will or should we carry on? What do you think? How, for the 12 of you that are online, or the 10 or so that are online, what would you like to do? Would you like to keep going, or you like to take a break? What would you like to do? Any choices? Since there's a few of us, we can sort of interact a bit. All right, keep going, but with a question mark. All right, that doesn't help me. Keep going. I assume what you mean is just keep going. Let's keep going then. All right, let's deal with this question. What have we said about the language of science and so forth? Verbal science. Halliday talks about the history of scientific discourses reveals new strategies evolving. It's the evolution of language. New ways of organizing the grammar as a resource for making meaning. The point being that how scientists came up with this is not just perhaps by inventing something new, but taking something that existed already and sort of making it, giving it a novel intensity. That's how Butt refers to it. Novel, new, intensity, much more frequent. They did this in order to, as Halliday explains, create a discourse that moves forward by logical and coherent steps. This is the motivation, each building on what has gone before. And the point was that these sort of ways in which language can be used have previously existed. In terms of looking back in the history of scientific discourse, going back to the early Greeks, they did already have this ability to transcategorize, to transform verbs and adjectives into nouns. There is sort of the way of making embedding a clause within another clause or within a noun phrase, this idea of rank shifting, extending the nominal group with embedded clauses and prepositional phrases, that also existed in the language of science. But then we observed it in terms of, in this work, optics. Sir Isaac Newton was writing this, and at the time, what we observe is that there were sort of ways of writing that at the beginning, when he describes how experiments are done, those were very verbal. It's not turning the verbs into nouns. It's actually using the verbs, and a lot more clause complexes. Arguments, conclusions from those experiments, though, then we began to see some sort of move toward the use of nominalizations, grammatical metaphor. But finally, when he actually sort of formulated the sort of mathematical principles, it was all expressed as simple sentences, one clause only. And the form of it, as we said here, was that A and X, and these are really lexically dense nominal groups, are related one to the other. Well, we use an equal sign here, A equals X. A and X, long, lexically dense nominal groups. They are related one with the other. How are they related? They're related using a verb. Halliday's point was then, by the end of the 18th century, we begin to notice already nominalizing the experiential, turning verbs into nouns, and using then verbs to signal the logical relationship between these happenings that have been turned into a something. So A causes X, or A proves Y, and these A and X are nominal groups. And that has become the most highly valued model for scientific writing. That's the way that we write for academic discourse. That's what I will expect you to see in the abstracts that you are analyzing. What has happened is that we have gone from the sort of normal default way of seeing the world, and that means that actions are carried out by verbs and things are represented by nouns. Instead, we turn those verbs into nouns. The educated girls becomes the education of girls. Women acquired the vote, the acquisition of the vote by women. I made this point in the review. This was the point that you should be making here in responding to this question. What was the drift? What is changing? What's changing is that we notice these shifts, verbs and adjectives becoming nouns. Conjunctions, instead of conjunctions connecting clauses, you have verbs connecting nominal groups. Instead of a complex clause, you have a simple clause. Because instead of verbs, you now produce nouns. And the clauses that existed before are now noun phrases. But then this shift, this is what was become the drift. This is the direction in which language is moving. This has reached a novel intensity. It isn't just individual shifts here and there. It is something which has achieved a certain level which we would call an intensity. It's become the way we speak. It's become the system of language. The instances have become the system. So this was Butt's point. Halliday's analyses of scientific discourse reveal a broad form of grammatical drift that creates a novel intensity. What is this novel intensity? It's what we just described. And there's been a steady drift then in the grammar towards things. Things have been foregrounded at the expense of qualities, processes, and relations. This is the kind of thing I expected you to be talking about, the idea of grammatical metaphor. Whereas we begin with sort of a default, a relation of congruence, that things are nouns and qualities are adjectives and processes are verbs, what we have done is redraw the connections. The happenings are turned into a something. And we've redrawn using what we call grammatical metaphor. Processes become nouns. And by that, they end up taking on the quality of nounness. So grammatical metaphor, that's part of this novel intensity, very important part of it, becomes the means to innovate in language, the level of structure. Just like traditional metaphor can be the basis of innovations at the level of words. This nominalizing grammar has given scientists enormous power over their environment, so much so that they can make the world stand still or even create new virtual realities. Language changes, language evolves. Okay. Well, I think that at this point, we will take a break because we've finished covering the test and so forth. And if there's any questions or any follow-up that you would like to, then this would be an opportunity for you to do so before we go on to the next topic. Okay. Any questions also related to your upcoming presentations and assignments? Also, please do feel free to ask. Okay. So we are at let's see, 12:54 my time here. Let's come back at 5 past the hour, okay? 1:05, and I'll begin again. Okay, we'll take a break now. Okay, let's continue. And A good question, Esther, about the analysis of the Romney speech. He mentioned why not analyzing those two clauses. Not because they're nominalizations. They're not. They're clauses. They're verbs, ing verbs, and they're what we would call non-finite verbs. All right. The rest of you can also see her question on the chat. They are Romney, as I say in my response, he is expanding on his idea of how, as I remember, it was how he'll get people off of food stamps, not by this but by this, and so the by phrase is by here is sort of acting as I would consider kind of conjunction, connecting those two. All right, arguable. Could the by be a prepositional phrase? Not really, because what you're following it with is a clause. All right, so when you have these words that can function either as conjunctions or as prepositions, you have to look at what follows, and if what follows is a clause, with a verb, then what you really have is a conjunction. All right, so that's how I would explain and respond. But yes, theme, we only analyze and when you're working on your analysis for these, the abstract itself, be sure that what you're analyzing for theme is not every clause, only those finite clauses. And remember what I mean by finite. Finite has to do with having primary tense. All right. Non-finite has no primary tense. It doesn't indicate tense. So what we normally would consider finite would be present tense or past tense. All right. Future we express in other ways. Okay, so that's what we analyze. Only looking at the finite clauses as for the purpose of theme. Okay, so good question. Thank you for asking it. And again, the rest of you who are here today, there's only a few of you. So please feel free to ask questions that might be related to what you're doing presently and working on and so forth. So this is a good time to ask. All right, now I want to come back to the topic of doing applicable linguistics. What's applicable linguistics? It's a phrase that Halliday used a lot. And you'll notice if you try to enter it into a Word document that it'll indicate that it is a misspelling. Well, it's purposeful. He's actually saying able to be applied, all right? And that's the idea that he's trying to express. He says this: I use applicable because applied linguistics has come to function in some kind of opposition to linguistics, meaning linguistics proper or theoretical linguistics. That's very true. If you say I do applied linguistics, that means you're most likely only looking at language and education, language and teaching. And it isn't considered to be linguistics proper. It's not considered to be theoretical linguistics. It's applied, all right? In a way, yes, it's considered sort of lower down. It's sort of second class. It's something that Halliday is rejecting, though. I want to reject, he says, this opposition. It shouldn't be that this is applied linguistics and this is theoretical linguistics. He says there should be a single sort of concept to unify the two. He says, I want a general term which gives the sense of something that is capable of having evolved in the context of being applied. That's significant. In other words, your theoretical linguistics, your linguistic theory should be something that has been developing while being put to use, while being applied. And what does that mean, applied? It means that you're trying to make use of the language in situations where people have sort of need a solution to a problem that is basically to deal with language, some deficiency, some problem, and you need to be able to address it with an expertise related to language. But this whole practice of being able to apply it should be something that is sort of, it's giving us insight then into how language works. It improves the theory. It feeds back into the theory. So what does applicability do? Applicability tests the robustness of the theoretical framework. How robust, how strong is your theory? Does it really give you insight into language? Well, how do you know, except you've actually been able to apply it to answer some questions? Does the theory enable one to answer questions about how language means and how language is valued in actual use? That's why I keep stressing this idea of we're looking at how do we make meaning, when how we make meaning means thinking grammatically. It is also, though, related to how we value language. And that's a very important aspect of language. We judge people based on language. I mean, people will judge, for example, a candidate, Romney versus Obama, now Trump versus Biden. They are judging people on the basis of how they use language, what they say, how they say it. Leads people to draw conclusions about how smart that person is, how knowledgeable that person is, how polite that person is, how socially aware that person is. You see, in systemic functional linguistics, the kind of linguistics that we do and we have been doing with text linguistics, it's not asking whether a sentence is grammatical. That very much is the case in formal linguistics. Can you say this, or can you say that? Is this considered grammatical, or is this not considered grammatical? But the point is that only gets you as far as the form of language. Form by itself can provide only a partial and thus unsatisfactory picture of how language works. Because language, what is its purpose? Its purpose is to mean. So if you're only looking at the form, you're not looking at the function. You're not looking at the meaning. What use is it what use are your insights? They're so limited. Instead, we need to ask, how does language function in the context of situation? That's why I keep telling you, frame it within the context of situation. How? Because you cannot look at language and cannot say this is what it means or even evaluate it, except you see it in the context of how our expectations for how you are using language, given what you want to talk about, who you're talking to, and how you say it. What is the function of language? What is the meaning? You can only really judge it on the basis of how people respond. You cannot say this is the meaning based on, well, this is what we think the writer means. This is what yes, we do draw such conclusions, we do interpret, but here we're actually trying to look at something which has some more objective basis for how we judge and how we say what it means. not just completely subjective, not just completely interpretation. And here, what can give it that objectivity? What can make it empirical? What can make it scientific? Except thinking grammatically. So when we look at a variety of language and we say, well, that is the way you use it, that's how you should speak in that context of situation, we would call that then, that is the register. And Eric Steiner, who's visited CityU a few times, he's from the University of Saarland in Germany, and his expertise is, yes, esteem and function linguistics, but especially with respect to translation. He said this: register in particular becomes a key organizing concept linking context and lexicogrammar, something which to my knowledge is not found anywhere else in modern linguistics. There's a uniqueness here. When we talk about text linguistics, you see here again, it's not just a focus on the text. You cannot focus just on the text it's by itself. If you look at the text without looking at the context, you're not getting the real picture, the full picture. So what is register? And this is a very important concept. Now, I had started to speak to you guys on this before, and I didn't finish. And so I want to sort of give this sort of background again to what I'm going to be talking about today. And I expect today to be able to finish the example I'm going to be talking about. And I had only begun to talk about it, got partway through it, and then time's up. So now I feel I've allocated enough time to follow this up. Register. What is register? Register is defined by field, tenor, and mode. Three concepts that are very important. What is a register? Ruqaiya Hasan, you'll remember her from the discussion about poetry and verbal art. She says this: how the speaker perceives the situation, how you see what's going on in terms of field, tenor, and mode, activates the choice of certain meanings which are realized by her choice of wordings. How you perceive the situation in terms of field, tenor, and mode will activate how you say something, what you're going to say. Will activate certain meanings, and meanings are realized by choices of wordings. These choices, meaning word choices, activated by the context of situation. This is what we mean by a register, an instance of some registral variety whose correlate is some specific category of context. You think of it, you're in a situation, all right? And that's exactly, let's go back to the example from the midterm test, Romney's debate performance. How he spoke in that situation depended very much on field, tenor, and mode. It depended on what he wanted to talk about. It depended on who he was addressing, for what purpose. It depended on the mode, the way in which he was speaking. That the situation within which he found himself activated certain choices about how he was going to communicate. And the way he communicated then is a register. There's an expectation. So when people listen to it, that's how they're going to evaluate. They're going to evaluate on the basis of, well, yeah, this is what we expect in a debate. We expect in a closing statement. This is what we expect between presidential candidates. So the text itself is sort of an encapsulation of context. That's how Hasan describes it. So what is our human experience? She breaks it down into 3 categories: action, relation, contact. 3 domains of human experience. Action, what's going on? Relations, who is acting with whom? Contact, how they are brought in contact to facilitate successful performance. Notice we're not talking about language at this point. We're talking about context. We're saying that there's a certain action that's going on, and those who are interacting are related somehow one to the other, and they are relating to one another in some particular manner. Try to think of it like this: what is going on? Who is acting with whom, and how they're brought into contact? What, who, how? She says this, and this is from an article that has just come out in language. It's called, the journal is called LangCT, Language and Context, Language, Context, and Text, and will appear in her collected works, of which I'm the editor. It's an article that she wrote, she was writing when she passed away. And she didn't quite complete it. She had nearly completed it, and it's been now published. She says this: examining action, relation, and contact, ARC, from the perspective of language as text, reveals the reach of language in human life. Every instance of context of situation holds in it what language has achieved for the community in past action. It represents the history of what language has achieved, what it is doing in the present, and what might be anticipated on the basis in the future. Language is changing, but language comes with a history. And so what you're saying is that this is what you are looking at in terms of every context of situation holds within it what your expectations are based on your experience with language, the history, what's taken place before, your familiarity with what you would expect in that situation. It's the history, but it's what's also going on now, and it's also what you would anticipate to take place in the future. It is time related. It does have a history. And so when Hassan talks about it, then she brings it back to, now these categories came from J.R. Firth. Firth was the mentor for Haldane. Firth was the one who was talking about context. When J.R. Firth talked about it, he talked about in terms of field. You see, that's very much related to the action. But here it's what is being talked about, not just what is going on. It's what is being talked about. And it relates to the experiential in language. Tenor. Here again, it's related to language. Who is talking to whom? Who is acting? Who's there? Who is on the stage talking to this person, relating to this person? Who are you relating with? That is the tenor. And this relates then to interpersonal meaning. And the mode by which you are communicating, the channel, relates to how you've been brought into contact with one another. How is the activity taking place? Field, tenor, mode. Very much is what, who, how. More generally, it's these 3 domains of human experience. Action. Within this action, there is what's going on. There is what are you talking about? In terms of the relations, who is acting with whom? Who are you talking to? And how they've been brought together. How is the activity How is this exchange unfolding? How is it taking place? Again, now corresponding to the textual meta function. Now, Halliday makes this point. In real life, texts carry value. Yeah, not just meaning, not just meaning, value. We need to explain that value. What is that value? How do you value it? Why do you value it? Highly, poorly. But we need to value it, he says, in terms of what we know about meaning, how meaning is made. Thinking about meaning means what? Thinking grammatically. So what we know about how we make meaning and how grammar is used to the choices that we make, define the choices that we make, how does that go back? And how can we use that now to explain the value that text has? Not just what it says, but how effectively it said it. So this is the goal then, meeting the challenge of explaining the value of texts in real life in terms of what we know about semiosis. Now, this is what I'm asking you to focus on in that assignment related to the abstract. You'll have done your analysis with your teammates, and you will have drawn some conclusions about its cohesiveness, texture, some related to its coherence, its architecture. But now, I want you to take it a step further. Explain the value of that text. Well, abstracts, as you'll notice from that webinar that's conducted, what he's talking about to you in that webinar is what will succeed when you send an abstract to a journal, and what will win over the reviewer. In an academic context, for example, suppose I want to go to a conference. And the conference won't probably ask you for the whole paper. They'll just ask you for an abstract. And so the abstract that you send will be very decisive in determining whether it gets accepted. So if it gets accepted, that means it's valued well. If it gets rejected, it means it wasn't valued well. So what is there? How can we explain it? And this is what I want you to be thinking of in terms of what we're doing with text linguistics. I want you to go to that next level. How do you value the text in real life? Now, the example, and this is, as I said, I began talking about this before. I didn't finish it. I only got part way. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to, in some cases, repeat what I mentioned before, but this will be only to build up to the point that I'm wanting to make at the end. The context here is a trial. And person X has been indicted on unlawfully trafficking the drug ice. Accused by the prosecution, he knowingly concealed the drug ice in a game console in his luggage for the purpose of transporting it from Hong Kong to Auckland, New Zealand. He pleaded not guilty. Person X denied knowledge of the dangerous drugs concealed in his game console, and he claimed that he had in fact been tricked into carrying the drugs. But nonetheless, he was convicted by a jury, and it was presided over by this deputy high court judge, we'll call Z or Z. And he was sentenced to 23 years and 9 months imprisonment. He was convicted by a jury. A jury listened to everything and on that basis made their decision. Some background. The defendant is a Tongan national. English was his second language. And I mentioned before to you, Tonga is this island off Australia, New Zealand. You can see where it is here. It's a small island. So there was a bit of a difficulty being able to find an interpreter. But an interpreter was nonetheless provided to interpret the court proceedings into Tongan for the defendant. Now the jury, Hong Kong residents. Now afterwards, a notice of application for leave to appeal against his conviction was filed. So the defense filed for an appeal, an application for leave to appeal. You have to apply to be able to appeal it. Now there's a hearing then which follows that deals with that application. The end of the story, just telling you the end of the story, well, up to that point, was the hearing by these appeal court justices, and there were 3 of them. The hearing on the application allowed the application. In other words, it can be appealed. And they not only allow the appeal, but at the same time, they put aside the conviction. They set aside the sentence and they ordered that there be a retrial. This was in 2019. In fact, person X is still waiting for their retrial. Now, you might ask, and this is where we get interested in what's taking place here. What were the grounds of appeal? Why did the counsel, the defense for person X, on what grounds could they appeal that against that conviction? Well, the appeal called into question specifically one aspect of what took place in that trial, and that was the judge summing up the evidence. At the end of the trial, all the witness statements, all the testimony from witnesses and everything that's transpired, the judge sums it up before the jury. It's quite lengthy. So the whole appeal came down to the question of whether the judge's summing up of the evidence was adequately translated, arguing that failure to do so denied the defendant a fair trial. In other words, there is an interpreter, there is a translation that was given, and the judge's summing up of the evidence, it was inadequate. The translation was inadequate. So therefore, the defendant did not have a fair trial. Now, the basis of this was that the judge failed to maintain an adequate speed in his summing up. And as a consequence, which the interpreter was unable to fully interpret the summing up to the applicant, the judge spoke too fast. And so, therefore, the interpreter couldn't keep up. That's one of the grounds for the appeal. So ground 2 argued the judge's summing up exceeded the ability of the trial interpreter. He spoke too fast. The interpreter could not keep up and therefore could not adequately carry out his task, the interpreter. Now, there was a third ground of appeal. The third ground of appeal said that the court interpreter was just inexperienced. And the low standard, he was inaccurate, the quality of the interpretation was so poor that deprived the applicant of a fair trial. The lack of experience of this court-appointed interpreter resulted in the interpreter being unable to keep up with the translation, mistranslating parts of the evidence, failing to translate or correctly translate the evidence, omitting evidence. 2 grounds. First ground is The judge spoke too fast. The interpreter couldn't keep up. Second ground, this ground 3, in fact, was that the court interpreter was too inexperienced. It's the interpreter's problem. So the counsel for the defense, we'll say Mr. Z here, failure of the interpreter to use the appropriate words or to interpret to an extent that fully reflected the answers given by the applicant could have conveyed the impression to the jury the applicant was unresponsive, incoherent, inconsistent, or even being evasive. And this could have resulted in the jury making adverse findings against the applicant and ultimately influenced the outcome of the trial. So the interpreter wasn't doing it properly. And so that would have made the jury perhaps believe that the applicant he wasn't responding. He was being asked questions and he was not responding, or he was incoherent, or he was inconsistent, or he was evading to answer. But all along it's because what's being argued is that the defendant was operating with this interpreter, and this interpreter was sort of not translating parts, mistranslating parts, omitting certain things. Well, it influenced then the outcome. So the conclusion of the appeal court justices, they're left with 2 points. One is the judge spoke too fast. The interpreter couldn't keep up. The second is the interpreter is too inexperienced and incapable. Their conclusion, the difficulties lay not with the language, but with the linguist. By linguist, they mean the interpreter. It's not that the judge spoke too fast, it's that the interpreter, he had the problem, not the judge. This is what they wrote. They said this: before concluding this judgment, we should emphasize that even though we allow this appeal on grounds 2 and 3, we do not accept the assertion that the judge spoke at too rapid a pace. It was, of course, too rapid for Mr. Afu, the translator, the interpreter, but that was only because Mr. Afu was not a professional interpreter and lacked the skills needed to provide a simultaneous interpretation. Now, the whole point comes back to this, and that is, does a defendant have the right to have an interpreter? The court, when the trial was ongoing, it became apparent to the defense that the defendant did not really follow what was going on. He needed an interpreter. And so the judge, the trial judge, he accepted that. He said that his primary concern was that the defendant should not be linguistically disadvantaged by his inability to understand and speak the language of the court. Now, even the judge said this: I am in agreement about the observations concerning his English. Since this is the judge speaking, do try to take verbatim notes, and at times it was difficult. Not because of the speed, but because of the use of language. I do not think it is something made up by the defense team. In other words, the trial judge sided with the defense team against the prosecution. The prosecution said, you don't need an interpreter. His second language is English. But the court is saying it's not just even about the speed, being able to be able to follow. It's the way language is used in a particular way, in a legal context, the legal terminology. So the defendant deserves to have an interpreter. You see, even though the defendant, yes, could speak English, the point that was being made was that in that context, in that legal courtroom context, the way they use language, the way they talk, the kinds of words they use, That register was something that he needed to have interpreted for him. He could not follow. Thus, the court concluded it's a real difficulty, it's a real risk that if the defendant is not properly expressing himself, he may not be having a fair trial, or he may not eventually be regarded as having a fair trial. In other words, the trial judge's concern was that, yes, he should have an interpreter. Otherwise, if he doesn't, because of the nature of language as it is used in the courtroom, this will not be a fair trial. So the trial judge was quite sympathetic, quite aware, linguistically aware, we could say, about the needs of the defendant for an interpreter. Because the language, the register, was something special. Well, it is true. A defendant does have a right to interpreter assistance. And this is guaranteed. The Hong Kong Bill of Rights, Articles 11.2 A and F, and they're listed here. All right, minimum guarantees to be informed promptly and in detail in a language which he understands of the nature and cause of the charge against him. To have the free assistance of an interpreter if he cannot understand or speak the language in court. The language in court. Context. The provisions of Article 11.2 A and F are comparable then to the Article 14.3 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and applies to Hong Kong by Article 39 of the Basic Law. The defendant has a right to interpreter assistance. The defendant's right to interpreter assistance based on this article extends to and encompasses all elements of the trial which affect the defendant's interests, assuring not only the defendant's comprehension, but also, more importantly, his meaningful participation in the trial, including his ability to make decisions on trial issues and give instructions to his legal representative on such issues. The judge, as you remember, that's why I say the trial judge was very linguistically aware, to the point that he was saying, because the language that is used here, not just that it's English, but it's legal English, it's legal language. That is in itself something which this second language, English as a second language speaker, may not be able to carry on, to be able to participate fully in the trial. Now, the interpreter, yes, was a problem. And the explanation is that the interpreter, because Tongan is so difficult to find an interpreter for, was that the court case was dragging on. They could not find an interpreter. That meant the defendant was spending his time in jail, and the jury was unhappy because the jury was being kept there on this case while they're trying to find an interpreter. And it kept dragging on, and they couldn't find anyone. Now, they did finally find an interpreter. This interpreter is not a professional interpreter. In fact, he was here for the Rugby Sevens to play in the Rugby Sevens. He is a rugby player. He's Tongan. He's born Tongan, but he was raised in Australia. But when they put it to him, will you please be the interpreter? It was put to him in a way like, help out this other guy, this Tongan guy who's here, and his court case is dragging on, and he's in jail, and we need an interpreter. Sympathetically, then, this rugby player agreed to do it. Now, this rugby player acknowledged his Tongan was not at a level of a native Tongan speaker in Tonga. He's born in Tonga, but he was raised in Brisbane. His Tongan is not even that of a native Tongan speaker. One thing that he noticed was that, in fact, this interpreter remarked, and that was that there were parts of the older Tongan language that he didn't understand and he couldn't speak, and like the words in law and stuff like that. You see, it boils down to it's not just, can you speak some Tongan? No. It's, can you be able to function and interpret words of a legal nature into Tongan? He was asked, for example, to translate DNA into Tongan. He could not. And DNA figured very prominently because the point was being made that this defendant's DNA was found on the drugs that were in that game console. He did not know the word in Tongan for suspicion. So knowing the language does not necessarily mean you know all the registers of that language. All right, so the question was put to him in this application for appeal. All right, so they didn't bring him. In fact, this was the first time that Skype was used, and this was before the pandemic. Okay, this had nothing to do with the pandemic, but this rugby player who had gone back to Australia, and they needed to interview him for this particular appeal court decision. And so the interview was carried out by Skype in the courtroom. And in the courtroom, then the question was asked, would it be right to say that if you felt that you were not up to the job of being an interpreter, you would have said so? In other words, the question was put to him, didn't you realize that you couldn't do it? He answered yes, and the fact that they said there wasn't anybody else within the country, and it was critical for somebody to be able to help to get the court proceedings underway, because there had been, from what I was told, there had been a fair bit of time that he was already incarcerated. Question, but if you felt that actually I'm not good enough to do this, you would have said so? He answered at the start, before I started, yes, I thought I was up for the job. Then obviously at the end of it, there's a lot more to it than I know. See, this is the point. Do you realize that what we are talking about here is that speaking the language does not mean you are able to master every register of the language. There was a lot more to it, he says, than I know. Now, the important point here is that, and I looking at it from the standpoint of the faulty interpreter assistance, when we talk about interpretation, it's simultaneous interpretation. It's not consecutive. It's meaning that as that person is speaking, the interpreter is speaking to the other person. Noting that dockside interpretation is simultaneous, not consecutive, the court realized that the defendant would have been listening. What was the defendant listening to? He's listening to the interpreter. He's not listening to the person speaking. So the defendant was not even aware of and able to listen to and hear what was being communicated by perhaps that witness or by that prosecutor or by a judge. Whatever was not communicated to the interpreter would have been lost on the defendant. In other words, all he could hear was the interpretation, and when the interpretation couldn't keep up and and a lot of it he's missing, he's not able to follow. Now, the point being that when an interpretation is carried out, for example, the interpreter sits next to the defendant, not in the interpreter booth. The interpreter booth is not functioning. It hasn't functioned since it was built. And so the interpreter sits in a chair next to where the defendant sits. The opposite end of the room are the justices, the three justices. In the middle are the counsel, and on the sides are the public gallery, and so forth. So the interpreter is sitting next to him, next to the defendant, talking to him, telling him what's happening, what's going on. So the interpreter was asked to estimate how much of the judge's summing up he was able to exactly interpret. The interpreter admitted only 20-30%. And after hearing the interpreter's testimony, which the justices hearing the appeal described as credible and compelling, you see, after the appeal court justices, those three justices, heard this testimony from the interpreter about how little he was able to keep up with it, they considered it so credible, compelling, they immediately paused the trial, the application for appeal. And the three justices left the room, left the courtroom to discuss the case. This was just after receiving the testimony from the interpreter. When they came back in, they said this: when an interpreter says that he was only able to interpret 20 to 30% of what had been spoken, was unfamiliar with key words and phrases which were frequently being used in the course of the proceedings, we were compelled to conclude the applicant had not been provided with constitutionally compliant standard of interpretation. Now, what was my role with respect to this particular case? As I mentioned before, I was called in to give sort of expert advice as a linguist. And specifically when the defense asked me to look at what had transpired in the courtroom, their first sort of idea was, please look at the speed of delivery. Did the judge speak too fast? Now, I do want to explain something. I have been asked to take part in this and give linguistic evidence from the legal aid department of the Hong Kong government. They are the ones who requested me to provide this advice to the defense team. So the defense team specifically said, would you please, and this was sort of the scope of what they wanted to look at, the speed of delivery. Now, what about the speed of delivery? The prosecutor argued that anyone listening to the recording, because it's all recorded, would conclude that the judge did not speak too quickly. Rather, he maintained the trial judge spoke articulately, clearly, and what he said was to comprehend. The trial judge, he spoke articulately, clearly. It's not that he did not speak too quickly. This is the prosecutor responding to this point of the defense team. They're saying the judge spoke too fast. Now, so I did a linguistic analysis. And I'm looking at the audio recording of the summing up that was delivered by this Deputy High Court Judge Zed. And he did this summing up over 2 days, all right? There's a lot of evidence, all right? And this evidence then, he sums up everything. It's all written out. He's written it all out beforehand. And he basically reads through it to sort of identify what it is who said what in terms of the witnesses and all the various aspects of what had transpired in that whole courtroom. This is the summing up. It took 2 days to do it. On one day, 25th of April, it took more than an hour, 70 minutes, 24 seconds. And on the next day, it was a bit longer. It was almost 2 hours. Now, remember, he's reading this to the jury and the defendant. So he's reading it to the jury, and the jury is supposed to be the jury doesn't have it written down in front of them. The jury only listens to it, only hears the judge speaking. Now, do you by now have something of an expectation? Is it just to do with the speed of delivery? Let's take a look at the speed of delivery. Okay, so the first day, little over an hour, 70 minutes. And if we take a look at the words spoken per minute, okay, so the time, 137, that's how the opening remarks, because it's sort of, the summing up breaks down into the following categories. We have the opening remarks. This was 137 words per minute. Bit faster when he directs on some important principles of law, 144 words per minute. He gives directions of law, again, a bit faster, 150. Then the elements of the offense, 145 words per minute. And then he begins the summary of his evidence, of the evidence that's been presented. The summary of the evidence, 161 words per minute. And then it gets up to, because it was nearly toward the end of the day, all right, and he said, he said to the jury, would you permit me an additional 15 minutes sort of to get it to a certain point before we close for the day? The jury agreed. The jury said yes. And in that additional 15 minutes, he got a bit faster, 176 words per minute. But overall, the first day, about 155 words per minute. Now, is that too fast? Go back to the second day. Nearly 2 hours, 1.92 hours. There was only one break, 20-minute break. Average words per minute, 172 words per minute. Now, that's faster, right, than the day before. And if you take a look at the sort of the speed, it nearly got up to 200 words per minute at one point. All right, so let's take a look. The summing up that was delivered by the Deputy High Court Judge, looking at the speaking rate, the words per minute, you can see it sort of climbed on the first day up to 176 words. In the second day, it got nearly up to 200 words per minute. Now remember, though, people are listening to this for an hour, a little over an hour on one day, 2 hours on another day. And what are they listening to? They're not like listening to even a lecture. They're listening to someone read what they have written that goes through everything that was said and everything that was looked at and everything that was considered. The summing up. So if we talk about words per hour, day one, 9,000 words per hour, and day two, 10,000 words per hour. All right, so that was what I came up with in terms of the speaking rate. So, but then the next question comes, right? You have to say this. It's not just how fast did he talk. This is what I want you to be thinking about, all right? This is where your ideas and what you're learning about text linguistics should start to sort of kick in. The next question you have to ask, though, is not just a simple question. Did the judge speak too fast? Well, that means it's sort of compared to what? How does the judge's speed of delivery compare with the normal speaking rate for this situation? for this situation. What is the normal speaking rate for that situation? In other words, normal speaking rate, does that mean like I'm speaking to you now? Does it mean like when I'm speaking in, when I'm in a conversation spontaneously, we're talking? Does it mean if I pick up a book and I start to read it to you? What's the normal speaking rate for this situation? Okay, we have to take a look at sort of some background then. The speed of delivery. The 11th Judicial Circuit Court in Illinois estimates the average rate of speech during court proceedings 150 to 160 words per minute. Okay, the 11th Judicial Circuit Court in Illinois. Average rate of speech. Now, this is how did they come up with this sort of statistic? Well, they're looking at what a court reporter was someone who would be typing in everything that was being said. And for the court reporter, these are sort of the expectations. A court reporter should be able to accommodate this average rate of speaking during the court proceedings, 150 to 160 words per minute. Now, and also, for example, in California court interpreter certificate examination, they would listen to a 3-minute tape recorded message of a judge speaking. The test would be carried out, conducted at 140 words per minute. All right, so we've seen that the average is 150 to 160. If they carry out a test of the court interpreter in California, they must be able to accommodate 140 words per minute. But now remember, it's really too general to say court proceedings, because court proceedings include different kinds of exchanges. Some are extemporaneous. Some are just, the prosecutor or the defense attorney may be asking a question of the witness and asking them to explain something, and they haven't prepared it. But on the other hand, you have some exchanges that take place in the court that are completely scripted, like the judge's summation of evidence. He scripts it out. He wrote it all out. He typed it all out. And he takes that summation of evidence, which he has written out, and he reads it. Yes, it is spoken, but it is read. It is written to be spoken. Differences in mode of delivery, spoken or written, scripted or free, those have consequences for the form that language takes. Speakers. This is from R.D. Gonzalez, Vasquez, and Mickelson. They say this: speakers reading from a prepared text tend to deliver faster. If you've gotten it all written down in front of you and you're reading it, you tend to deliver faster. None of the pauses, changes of pace, or repetitions which normally help to convey meaning, which give the spoken language its immediate intelligibility. Got that? When you're speaking from a prepared text, you tend to deliver faster. None of the pauses. When we're talking spontaneously, even like when I'm lecturing to you now, I'm not reading it from a prepared text. There are pauses. I'm repeating myself at certain points. Sometimes I'm talking faster. Sometimes I'm talking slower. Now that's very different than if you are reading from a prepared text. I hope you're seeing this. The context of situation, so important for deciding how we communicate, what the nature of the text is going to be. So now, the court interpreter. I would describe the court interpreter, especially when it comes to the summation of evidence, as having an impossible task. Why? In fact, on the second day, the defendant's counsel told the judge that the interpreter was having difficulty keeping up with the judge's pace of delivery. Remember, the judge is reading the summation of evidence. It did in day one, a little over an hour. The second day, morning, immediately at the outset, the defendant's counsel says to the judge, the interpreter can't keep up. Your delivery speed is too fast. What did the judge do? Instead of decreasing the delivery speed, the judge became even faster. The judge's summary of evidence given by the defense's expert witness. Now, this is important. In other words, during the summation of evidence, the judge is talking about summarizing the evidence that was given by the prosecution. And then he gets to the summation of evidence provided by the defense. Specifically, at one point, the judge is summing up the expert witness testimony about the DNA that was given by this expert witness on behalf of the defense. He was the fastest that he had been the whole time. 200 words per minute. In that 6 minutes in which he gave this, he summed up the evidence given by the defense's expert witness on day 2. In that 6 minutes, 200 words per minute. Fastest that he had been speaking. Already had been told the interpreter can't keep up. Already asked, please slow down. He speeds up, but he even speeds up the most when it comes to summing up the evidence that would be helpful to the defendant. Keep in mind, the judge is reading from a prepared written text. So the court interpreter, he is performing essentially the same task as a translator of a written text, but at a speed of 200 words per minute. 40 times faster than normal translating work. 40 times faster. Now, the basis for that calculation that I made was that the United Nations stipulates that the requirement for their translators is that they do 6 to 8 pages or 2,000 to 3,000 words per day. That's the normal speed. That's the normal requirement for translators, when they're translating written documents. The court interpreter is also translating the judge reading from a written document. And if the speed is up to 200 words per minute, then the interpreter is having to work 40 times faster than normal translating work. Now, it doesn't matter that this interpreter was a rugby player who was already not professionally qualified. That is really beside the point, because what court interpreter, even though professionally trained, can keep up with that pace of delivery for that length of time? One scholar who looks at interpreting for international conferences, Seleskovich, says this absurd pace quickly reduces the interpreter to a state of mental and physical exhaustion. She is speaking generally, by the way. She's not speaking about this unqualified court interpreter who is a rugby player who just happened to be brought in. She's talking generally. This absurd pace quickly reduces the interpreter to a state of mental and physical exhaustion, and his usefulness to the listener is practically nil when compared to the service he is able to render when dealing with free speech. Free speech. Simultaneous, extemporaneous speech, with all its pauses and all its changes in speed. She's saying that the interpreter, under such circumstances, is reduced to a state of mental, physical exhaustion and usefulness, which is practically nothing. But as a linguist, it wasn't just dealing with this speed of delivery. That's not the whole point, is it? There's other aspects that complicate this, because the difference between speaking and writing is not just boiled down to speed of delivery. It's also an issue of grammatical complexity. Now, you can look at certain linguistic features that cause comprehension problems. Now, there was a study that was done, a groundbreaking study, 1979, Charo and Charo. And they looked at jury instructions and they identified certain linguistic features that specifically cause comprehension problems. What are they? The use of passive constructions in subordinate clauses. Okay, you know what that is. Subordinate clause, a dependent clause. The use of the passive in a dependent clause. Okay, the combination of many clauses within one sentence. A lot of hypotaxis and parataxis. And the third was with deletion. What's with? Well, that's where you have a WH word and the verb to be is, and you delete them. In other words, when you have like a relative clause and you omit the relative pronoun. I'll give you some examples. And these examples come from this actual court case. Okay, the use of passive constructions in subordinate clauses. Now, here I'm using in terms of rank-shifted clauses too. I'm going to include the rank-shifted clauses. Notice, in the case of the DNA material found on the wrapping, that's a passive construction. 3 possible points where the defendant's DNA could have been transferred to the wrapping indirectly. Passive. Combination of many clauses within one sentence. This was one of the sentences. The third possible point of transference would have taken place inside room 1740, according to Dr. L, after the video recorded interview of the defendant had concluded, and Officer Mac 8195 entered the room to perform the task of putting the exhibits, especially the drug exhibits, into the tamper-proof envelopes. That's all. One sentence. With deletion. Well, you will also remember Dr. L using the graphics on page 33 of the first defense bundle to explain to us the research which was conducted on the transference by way of the investigator's glove onto another surface. Now, look at this sentence. You looked at what it means by each of these, all right? The use of the passive in a dependent or rank-shifted clause, combination of many clauses within one sentence, with deletion, the omitting of the relative pronoun. Now look at this. This is one sentence. Contains all 3. Red, use of passive in a subordinate rank-shifted clause. Black, many clauses within one sentence. With deletion, 1F, which was admitted. Okay, so this one sentence illustrates these linguistic features that are known to cause comprehension problems, and these are contained throughout this trial judge's summation of evidence. But that's not all there is. There's one more. lexical density. What's lexical density? That's where you pack a lot of information into it. Now, Halliday makes this point. A clause in extemporaneous speech. You know what extemporaneous is, right? It just means spontaneous speech. All right, you're just on the spur of the moment. It's not planned. It's not written out. A clause in extemporaneous speech, just talking, typically contains 2 content lexical words. 2 content lexical words. That's all. Written language, including what is written to be spoken, more likely to contain between 4 to 6 content lexical words per clause. All right, so 2 if it's extemporaneous, 4 to 6 if it is written to be spoken. Okay, what about the lexical density then in the summation of evidence? Now, I'll have to qualify that by admitting something, and that is that Halliday says lexical density in scientific writing, he says, may go much higher. Lexical density gets to around 13 or greater. When that happens, the text becomes difficult to comprehend. Got it? If it's just extemporaneous speech, it's 2. If it's written to be read, for example, it's written out, then 4 to 6. But it can get even greater. But if it gets to around 13 or greater, then you're getting into problems with our ability to comprehend it. Well, for example, in this sentence, there are 15. Lexical density is 15. We're counting just the content words, not the grammar words, all right? Just the content words themselves. That is what gives it the lexical complexity. But why does it have lexical complexity? Because you have those embedded clauses that modify the nouns before it. The DNA material, which was found on the wrapping. There are at least 3 possible points. Points where? Because you have that embedding, that rank shifting, those embedded clauses post-modifying the nouns, you add so many more words. As you're doing this, it's grammatically, in this sentence, it's grammatically simple. Because you have all that embedding. So it comes across as one simple sentence. There's no expansion. It's only embedding. But the embedding is adding all these words to it. That's what happens when we write. That's typical of the language of science. It's typical of the language of bureaucracy. It's typical of the language of legal writing. So I went through and I analyzed the summation of evidence in terms of its lexical density. I won't go through all the examples here. But notice, what I did was I looked to see what happens when we have lexical density, which goes above 10, for example. The judge's summary of evidence, now I'm looking here, judge's summary of evidence given by the defense expert witness. Remember that 6 minutes that I mentioned to you previously? That 6 minutes where the trial judge was summing up the expert witness on behalf of the defendant, put forward there by the defense team. In that 6 minutes, remember I said it got up to 200 words per minute, the fastest. Well, now notice, look at that over a course of that 6 minutes. How many times the lexical density went up above 10? The average lexical density was 5.68. But quite often it got above that. It got quite high. Add to that where there are embedded passives and where there is whiz deletion and where the number of clauses is high, you have a really difficult time to comprehend. Not just the interpreter, the jury. The jury's listening to it in English. They're not relying on the interpreter. But the jury will not be able to follow. Example, if I gave you a lecture, 2 hours, in which I read to you one of my papers, considering the fact that there would be a lot of lexical density because of the way it's written, and there would be the speed, which would be faster because everyone tends to, when you have something written to be spoken, you read it faster. What's the problem here? The problem here is this idea of the summation of evidence. There are other issues too, ambiguous reference. I mean, let me just read this one to you. Mr. N mentioned to Officer P, the defendant seemed to have coughed, cleared his throat. This is from the summation of evidence. Exhaled strongly, tapped the table, tapped the telephone, stretched and leaned forward, rubbed, wiped his eyes, lips, and nose a few times, rubbed or scratched his face, head, and his neck a few times. These are all things that members of the jury you can see for yourself. Now, what's these? These, the judge is saying you can see it for yourself. So basically he's validating. But what does these refer to? To have coughed, cleared his throat, exhaled, tapped the telephone, stretched, leaned, wiped his eyes, lips, and nose a few times, rubbed or scratched his face, head, and his neck a few times. What you are being told is that everything that was just said here, all of this, are things that you, the jury, you can see for yourself, and you can decide if they happened or did not happen, but you can see for yourself. These are what you can see for yourself. Basically, the way he said it was to validate it. Now, the other one is also, at the very end, he says, again, this is recorded on a disc. What is recorded on a disc? Is it that the defendant had reached out to touch one of the plastic bags containing one of the lumps of dangerous drugs? Or is it that the defendant did not directly touch the lump, just the surface of the transparent plastic bag? This is recorded. What does this refer to? Ambiguity. Consider something here. The demands of the register. What's going on in this particular register? The judge is delivering the summation of evidence. He's giving the facts, but he also uses specialized legal terms. The tenor. Judge is reading the summation to the jury. The interpreter is translating for the defendant. Mode. It's a written statement read aloud by the judge to the jury for just over 1 hour on one day and 2 hours on the second day. Some observations. The summation read aloud for over an hour on the first day, interrupted by a brief break of 42 seconds, during which he asked for the additional 15 minutes, and nearly 2 hours on the second day. There's interruption by a break of about 20 minutes. The court interpreter was required to mentally process and interpret the judge's summing up into Tongan, which has the rarest major type of word order, verb initial, very different than English. The court interpreter needed to carry out his task at 40 times the speed of that required of a United Nations translator of written documents. Judge Z, the trial judge, read his summation. So my observation is this. So as with other written texts, his summary carried a high information load, high lexical density, compounded not only by a substantial amount of technical jargon, but also complex grammatical constructions. All of that required considerable mental alertness, language proficiency in order to be able to process and comprehended. The judge's summing up was delivered at a rather fast pace for over an hour and had to have taxed the mental processing of the court interpreter to such an extent that his performance would have been significantly diminished. Think about the requirements of the context. We said that the judge delivers his summation using specialized legal terms. Well, the receivers, the jury, the translator, they have to be familiar with that specialized legal terms, with those special legalized terms. In this case, the judge was reading the summation of evidence to the jury. The interpreter was translating for the defendant. And because the interpreter was inexperienced, he didn't realize that, in fact, the interpreter can ask the judge to repeat it and to clarify it. But he wasn't familiar. He wasn't someone who had the experience to realize this. The mode, because it is a written statement read aloud by the judge, it carried a high information load, substantial amount of technical jargon, complex grammatical constructions. The requirements of the context are such that it makes it very difficult, especially the summation of evidence, to be comprehended, not just by the interpreter, but even by the jury. Now, why is the summation significant? Why does it matter? I mean, isn't it just a summary at the end? So that's what the prosecution was asking. The prosecution said, if this is an appeal on the basis of the judge's summing up, why does it mean that even if the interpreter didn't do a good job, it doesn't reflect on the defendant at all? If this is based on the summation of evidence and the interpreter's behavior at that time, then why is a fair trial being considered? Why is there even a question about whether there was a fair trial? The prosecutor argued that since the judge's summing up it's primarily addressed to the jury, it's not the defendant. Whatever deficiency existed in the interpretation of the summing up for the defendant should not call into question the verdict that the jury made. And he cited one case where the summing up was not interpreted to all the defendants. The absence of interpretation of the summing up did not render the conviction unsafe. In other words, he says in this particular case, the summing up was not even interpreted to all the defendants. They didn't even didn't even receive interpretation for this. But the absence of that interpretation didn't lead to quashing the conviction. The appeal court justices responded to this, though. And what they noticed was that in that particular case did not, as they put it, did not in any way devalue the importance of summing up or suggest that a defendant did not have a right to have the summing up interpreted to him. Why? Because they noticed that that trial judge who had written out his summing up, it was a substantial document, quite a good deal of factual material, all these things. He gave that written document to the defense, to the counsel. In other words, what he was about to read, he had printed it out and he gave it to the counsel. Now, there's an interesting conclusion here. Appeal court justices, I was asked to write this down and to give this report. And I gave this report to the counsel, what I've just been presenting to you here, which to me showed that in terms of this summation of evidence, speed was one aspect, but not the only one. It very much went to the the nature of how it was, this reading something that was written, reading it aloud. And because it's written, it has the grammatical complexity, it has the lexical density, all these aspects to it. So I written out this report. And this report was part of what the defense gave to the appeal court justices in advance as the grounds of appeal. So when the judges came into the room at the very beginning, and I was asked to be there in the courtroom, and I was asked to be sitting at one of the counsel tables and so forth. When the justices sat down, the first thing they said, because they asked then the defense counsel to sort of put forward the grounds for appeal. And the counsel started to introduce what the grounds were, as I mentioned at the beginning. And the judges, one of the judges, the lead judge, the appeal court justices, we do not want to hear from Professor Webster. And the counsel, I was honestly really quite surprised. I mean, you know, I hadn't even been able to say anything, and they immediately saying, we do not want to hear, specifically said, we do not want to hear from Professor Webster. Of course, they had in their hands the report that I had prepared. And the counsel said, well, can we delay that until after we have had the first testimony from the interpreter, and then make a decision after that? And so the appeal court justices said, okay. Point was, they did not want to hear this linguistic evidence. They did not want to hear it, since the evidence provided in the interpreter's testimony, that convinced them. But before that, before they had even heard from the interpreter, they already made up their minds they did not want to hear the linguistic evidence. Why is that the case? Why was that the case? Because what was being called into question is not just this one trial, but the way in which language is carried out and conducted. That the manner in which, for example, this court case, this, not just this one, but generally, this ability, that's why they made it. This is not about the language. This is about the linguist. Not in linguist, they meant the interpreter. In other words, this is only to do with the interpreter, not language. Because if they called into question language, it would call into question, as one of the counsel later said to me, it would open the floodgates. And you could not open the floodgates to pointing out problems in the way that language is conducted in the courtroom. Remember how they said the difficulties lay not with the language. This was a very important point for them. They did not want to deal with, did not want to address this issue of problems in the way that language is conducted in the courtroom, even though you can easily see that the way it is conducted is a way that makes the interpreter's task basically impossible, and most likely the jury cannot even follow either. The linguistic evidence, however, conclusively explains not only the interpreter's inability to provide adequate interpretation assistance, but also establishes the excessive linguistic demands placed on the interpreter as well as members of the jury, which makes it basically that the jury is not comprehending what's going on as the judge delivers his summation of evidence. Why is the summation of evidence important? What is its purpose? It's supposed to be a neutral summing up of the facts of the case. Or Is it the judge's version of the facts? I ask that question because you notice the increased speed when describing the evidence given by the defense's expert witness. That to me sort of was prejudicial. Examples of the ambiguous reference. In other words, he's saying you can see this, but what's he actually referring to? So the next question, how can it be improved? Change the mode of delivery. Or provide the judge's summation in writing for the jury and the interpreter. Why not just take that summation of evidence, which is all written out, and which the judge is reading, and give that to the jury so they can read along with the judge? Reduce the legal terminology, simplify the clause structure. The fact that it is written out in a way that we're normally used to writing and reading. For this kind of situation seems contrary to what would be the best for justice to take place. Well, it's now almost 2:40, so, and I didn't give you a break in the meantime here, so I think that I'm not going to go on to the Steve Jobs commencement address. I'll do that in a follow-up lecture after your presentations. Please remember your presentations beginning next week, and thank you for the 10 or so of you that have been online, and thank you for coming today. And I'll just leave, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to put them into the chat. And for the last 10 minutes or so, I'll be here, and if there's anything you'd like to say or comment, welcome your feedback. Okay, so thank you for coming, and hope you have the rest of a good day holiday. Thank you.